Arguably one of the biggest misconceptions concerning the American Revolution is the way in which the Continental Army fought on a battlefield and the way their soldiers were trained. Many Americans around the country today, myself included, remember hearing in grade school that one of the biggest reasons the Americans won this war against the British for American independence was that while the British Army was on that battlefield lined up, shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, in what is known as a linear formation, anywhere from 2 to 3 rows deep, all firing and loading in alternating fashions. The American Army didn't fight like that. Many Americans remember hearing that while the British were lined up on that field, the Americans were in wilderness areas like this, taking advantage of things like cover and concealment whenever and however they could. So it leads to a lot of confusion when our visitors show up to our museum and they hear that the way an infantry was really trained was by linear formation, by battalion. You line your men up shoulder to shoulder, all to account for the weaknesses of the weapon in their hand. Smoothbore muskets, they were short range, very slow to load weapons. So if you wanted to make that weapon intimidating or effective on that battlefield, you had to line your men up. You had to mass the soldiers together. But if you've heard somewhere, somehow, that the American Army fought in unconventional ways, you're not wrong. The American Army did have units specifically designed to fight like that. That's not the myth. The myth is that every single soldier was fighting like that. In reality, the American Army had specialized units of elite soldiers that were specifically designated to fight in these unconventional methods. It took a lot of training, dedication, and bravery on behalf of the soldiers that did this. And by today's standards, these units, they would be known as special operations. In the 18th century, they were known as light companies. So today, we're going to talk about a soldier that wore a slightly different uniform than everybody else, and fought a little bit differently than everybody else. And we'll show you how it was done. Now, as their name suggests, light companies, or units of light infantry, were traveling and fighting in lighter numbers. As opposed to being organized by an entire battalion, these units were usually detached from the rest of their army in those smaller groups, and because they were in smaller numbers, they were given specific missions to perform. Their job was usually to act as skirmishers. Now, skirmishing is defined as an episode of irregular or unpremeditated fighting. That means, as opposed to being on the front lines of a battlefield, light companies were typically assigned to reconnaissance missions, or possibly guarding battalions of infantry soldiers while on the march, or they were tasked with raiding enemy outposts in the middle of the night. Before the Americans had organized their own official company of light soldiers, the British Army had light troops on North American soil well before the American Revolution.
At the time of the 7 Years' War, a British regiment typically consisted of 9 companies, 8 hat companies or battalion companies, and then a special company of grenadiers. These were specialized troops, usually larger, more experienced soldiers, very imposing. Not only were they often 5'10" or taller, but of course height was no limiting factor. They could be different heights, but usually they were taller and bigger men. Usually had some type of distinctive headwear. Typically in the 7 Years' War, a mitered cap. By the time of the American Revolution, the bearskin that people are so often familiar with. Again, adding to their height and making them that much more imposing. At that time, it was found, though, that they needed some specialized troops, another type of specialized troop, to operate in the broken country that was typical in North America. So they started experimenting during the 7 Years' War with light troops, or light bobs. These were usually men drawn from the other companies, and even at that time, they started putting the flank companies, the grenadiers, and these light infantrymen into specialized battalions that operated separately from their parent organizations. By the time of the American Revolution, this becomes more formalized in '71, and you have actual 10 company regiments in the British Army. So you have your 2 flank companies, your grenadiers, and your light bobs, then your battalion companies. The light infantrymen usually were agile, quick, were capable of independent action, usually pretty good shots, taking advantage of ground cover, that type of thing. Usually had specialized equipment. Instead of the larger, heavier regimental, they'd often have lighter cut-down jackets, even roundabouts, short jackets that help them deal with the weather a little bit better and movement a little bit better. Often the headgear would be different. Early war, often a round hat. Later in the war, often some type of specialized cap that might have a leather shield on it. It might be made out of felt or completely made out of leather. So you see a lot of variety. There's no standard pattern. But this kind of set them apart, again, as specialized troops. They're often out in front of the army screening and skirmishing. They'd be on the flanks protecting the movement along the march, often used in close pursuit of a fleeing enemy. Their effectiveness was generally pretty good, although it would often vary depending on how many American troops they were facing. But generally it was found that they did a pretty good job and continued to be used. In fact, you see some of the light infantry tactics being employed by the main army itself.
Now don't get me wrong, the Americans had skirmishers during this war as early as 1775. They just didn't quite look like those British light companies. Their kit was a little bit different.
I'll be talking with you briefly about Daniel Morgan and his riflemen. If you haven't done any research on Daniel Morgan, I recommend that you do so. He was a very fascinating figure. As a young man, he settled in Winchester, Virginia, which during the early to mid 1700s was considered the frontier. He plowed fields, he worked at a sawmill, and he drove a wagon. He would transport supplies throughout the region. During the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, Morgan was impressed into service, hauling supplies for the British. During that time, he had a physical altercation with a British officer, and for that he was punished with 500 lashes. He carried those scars on his back for the rest of his life, and he developed an intense dislike for the British. Later on, during the war, he was shot through the neck. It took out most of his teeth. Somehow he survived that as well. So by the time of the Revolutionary War, he had this disdain for the British and that wartime experience. So he was well suited to lead troops during the Revolution. He combed the frontier of Virginia and recruited about 100 riflemen to serve in his company. He received a commission as a captain for doing that. But part of the recruiting process was a shooting demonstration or target practice. He would gather up the local men, they would demonstrate their shooting skills, and they were selected based upon their marksmanship. Some of the items they would have carried, instead of being equipped with a smoothbore musket, Morgan's riflemen were armed with a rifle. So there is a key difference between the rifle and the musket. The rifle contains rifling or spirals cut inside the barrel. That rifling places a spin on the shot, making the weapon much more accurate at a longer range. Maximum effective range for a smoothbore musket is about 100 yards. In the hands of a skilled rifleman or marksman, the rifle can be accurate up to 300 yards away. So Morgan's men were outfitted with rifles, and they had quite an impact on the Revolutionary War. During the Battle of Saratoga, which was a turning point, once the Americans won there, the French realized that they could stand up to the British and win battles. Morgan and his men took out many of the British officers, and of course that disrupted the command structure. The enlisted men were quite confused, and it really turned the tide of battle in the Americans' favor. So their primary weapon was the rifle. Because this weapon lacks a bayonet, a musket would be fitted with a bayonet, but the rifle is not. Morgan's men were also equipped with bladed weapons, like a tomahawk, for example, or perhaps a a knife of some sort. They were also wearing hunting shirts. And this had a psychological effect on the British troops. The British soldiers, they knew the men that wore these hunting shirts were expert marksmen. So that apparently struck fear in many of the British soldiers.
On August 28, 1777, General George Washington finally organized a company of American light troops.
6 companies of Virginia and Pennsylvania riflemen were organized outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1775. These 6 rifle companies would become the basis of what would later be known as the Continental Light Infantry Corps. This corps would be reorganized every year depending on the needs of the Army for that season. In 1779, they were under the command of Brigadier General Anthony Wayne. By this time, they were known as the elite striking force of the Continental Army and acquitted themselves quite favorably at the Battle of Stony Point in July of 1779. 1781, they were reorganized to fight against Benedict Arnold's forces in Virginia. Probably the most famous action of the Continental Army Light Infantry was here at Yorktown at the Battle for Redoubt 10. It was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton. They were assaulted Redoubt 10 in a pure bayonet fight, secured the redoubt, which is one of the important parts in securing our victory here at Yorktown.
And when the French finally decided to get involved in this little war of ours, they brought some of their own light troops too, and they actually fought right here in Yorktown, Virginia.
So for the French, their light infantry units are going to be referred to as chasseurs, meaning hunter in French. And I apologize if I'm pronouncing any of this wrong. I do not actually speak French personally. But these are going to be troops that are specifically chosen for their good marksmanship, and they're also going to be chosen for their ability to utilize quick maneuvers either out on the battlefield or whatever situations they happen to find themselves in. So during the siege here at Yorktown in October of 1781, you're going to see chasseurs in the Santon Regiment. They are actually assisting in constructing with the parallels, the second parallel to be specific. And they are assisting the sappers and miners with that construction. They're all under the command of General Rochambeau. And actually they are able to mostly complete the second parallel within one night, which is a pretty incredible feat. At least I personally think so. You are also going to see chasseurs in both the Gatinois Regiment and also the Royal DuPonts, and they are going to be involved in the attack on Redoubt 9 specifically. And the Royal DuPonts, that is usually a unit most people have not heard of before. They're very interesting because these are going to be actually German soldiers. So you can see DuPonts and Zweibrücken, same name for the same place. They are actually a German regiment that is essentially on loan to the French and helping out with French involvement during the siege here at Yorktown. So another siege where you will see involvement from French chasseurs is actually the Siege of Savannah in 1799. And these are going to be chasseurs that are part of the Volontaires de Saint-Domingue, and that they are going to be from where modern-day Haiti is located. And mostly this unit is comprised of free black men. You will also see some who are enslaved, but they're serving in exchange for hopefully their freedom at the end of their involvement. And even though the Siege of Savannah will be a British victory, these chasseurs are actually going to fight bravely throughout the whole engagement. There's actually a monument down in Savannah that is dedicated to them today. And I really wish we had a reproduction of their regimental. Because it is so cool looking. But also for the chasseurs, you're actually going to see that one of the drummers, Henri Christophe, he will actually later become the king of Haiti.
In a letter he wrote to Congress in January of 1778, General Washington wrote that the American light infantry would be accompanied by light horse. Some light troops fought on horseback too.
So very late in 1776, the Continental Congress authorized the creation of 4 different units of cavalry that would collectively become known as the Continental Light Dragoons, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th regiments of the Continental Light Dragoons. And that word dragoon, it implies that more often than not, these units are going to be functioning as what they knew as light cavalry. which means they're going to be doing a number of different actions for the army. The light dragoons could be stationed in the vanguard, for example, in the front of the army to scout ahead and report back. You want to utilize the speed of those horses. So a lot of what they're doing is going to be scouting related. You're going out, you're picking up information, you're moving faster than the infantry so you can report back to your army what the other army is doing. You could station the dragoons on the flanks of your army to protect the flanks, make sure one side or the other doesn't get overrun. And functioning in the context of light infantry or the light dragoons, they could fight on horseback and they could fight on foot as well. In fact, the largest single cavalry engagement of the American Revolution was very close to us here at Yorktown. It was just across the river over in Gloucester Point, so not too far away from where we are. And just like their approach to combat or their approach to their use in the army could vary, their outfits, their style could vary as well. You see some examples of different headgear worn by different units of the Continental Light Dragoons. They might wear forage caps, they might wear leather style jockey caps like these, even going down to different bands going around the hat. So a lot of variation in the headwear, a lot of variation in the uniforms. Some wore blue coats, some wore white coats, some wore green coats. So a lot of variety in the uniform and a lot of variety in the type of weaponry they're carrying too. Remember, you're on horseback for a good part of your career if you're in the Continental Light Dragoons, so your mobility is going to be a little bit different. The things that you're able to do on horse is going to be a lot different than what you're able to do on foot. So they're carrying different types of weapons, things that might look like what an infantryman would carry, but just a little bit different. So first thing I want to point out is something like this. This is known as a carbine. It looks like one of those smoothbore flintlock muskets that the infantrymen are carrying, but this is simply a smoothbore flintlock musket on a shorter scale, so it's not as long, and so you're able to move this around a little bit better if you're sitting on top of a horse. The Continental Light Dragoons also might carry dragoon pistols like these. They could sling their holsters over top of what's called the pommel, that little kind of ball that comes up in the front part of the saddle. They could put their holsters there with easy access to their dragoon pistols. But some officers in the Continental Light Dragoons would argue that the cavalryman's best weapon is the cavalry saber. A lot bigger, longer, heftier than your infantry officer's small sword. The cavalry saber could be used to cut and thrust at the enemy. And you can also use the big heavy pommel here, that knuckle guard, to, punch at the enemy and cause a lot of damage. So if you're in the cavalry, you better be ready to get up close and personal. Oftentimes the Continental Light Dragoons were skirmishing and acting against the British Legion under Banastre Tarleton, or maybe the Queen's Rangers here under John Graves Simcoe. So there's a lot of British cavalry units and the Light Dragoons to look out for, but there were 4 units of the Continental Light Dragoons that served, again, from 1776 all throughout the rest of the war.
The Light Dragoons, along with the Continental's light infantry, made up what was known as a flying army. They were trained to fight the enemy anytime, anywhere. It didn't matter what the threat was, they were prepared for it. They were given their own surgeons, their own quartermasters, even their own private stocks of ammunition and weapons. Light infantry tactics included a lot more than hiding behind trees. According to a British light infantry manual published in 1772, light troops fought by file instead of rank. Each file had a space of 2 feet or more between them and could be 10 paces apart. They never wheeled or circled like the heavy infantry, and when in a wooded area, they were taught to lower their firelocks. When firing toward a threat, each file would act independently. Some would fire while others moved. During this irregular fire, the front and rear man of each file loaded and fired opposite each other. The second soldier loaded his weapon while the first stood ready to shoot. When the second man had finally announced that he was loaded, the first would fire, and immediately after, the second man would step up before the first, and the irregular fire would continue in this pattern. Soldiers were also taught to cover themselves whenever they could with trees or other foliage nearby. This firing pattern would allow them to advance forward by having the second man step forward, or it could allow them to retreat by having the first man simply move back. Either way, it took training to coordinate that type of gunfire.
Loaded. Keep that in.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
cool.
I don't think I'd be good enough for those guys. The light infantry eventually became such an impressive unit in the American Army that eventually, in 1780, service in the American light infantry wasn't something a soldier could just sign up for. It was a service that they were selected for. And what got a soldier selected for service in those particular units was by doing impressive things. You know, maybe that soldier was a bit faster with his musket than everybody else in his regiment. Maybe he was a better shot than everybody else in his regiment. Or maybe he was stronger, just healthier than most. Or maybe he was very brave in the face of a bayonet charge. Or it could have been even more impressive. Maybe he smiled and got a little giddy whenever a bayonet charge happened and was excited to fight back. And yeah, that probably made the guy a bit crazy, but crazy's what these units needed.